The horse beneath him moved with the steady rhythm of a creature born to endless horizons, and Elias Vance let himself sway with it, his body remembering the motion from countless miles behind him. The Wyoming Territory stretched out before him like a vast, unforgiving canvas painted in shades of brown and gold, the late summer sun beating down mercilessly on the scorched earth. Above, the sky pressed down with a weight that seemed almost physical, an immense dome of washed-out blue that made a man feel small and insignificant. The wind was his only companion, a restless spirit that sent dust devils spinning across the plains and rustled through the sparse sagebrush with a sound like whispered warnings. It carried the scent of baked earth and dying grass, of distant rain that would never reach this parched land. In the far distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the horizon, their peaks shrouded in a haze that could have been dust or heat or the smoke from some far-off wildfire. Elias shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking beneath him, and pulled his hat lower against the glare. He was 28 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the weathered quality of his skin made him look older. His face was lean and angular, carved by wind and sun into something hard and enduring. Dark hair, too long for town standards, brushed his collar, and his clothes bore the dust of many days' travel. Behind him lay the ruins of everything he had once called home, the small farm in Kansas where he had grown up, where his father had broken his back trying to coax life from stubborn soil, where his mother had sung while hanging laundry in the prairie wind. All of it gone now, claimed by drought and debt, sold to satisfy creditors who had never set foot on the land they now owned. His parents were buried in the cemetery beside the old church, and his younger sister had gone east to work in a factory, her letters growing fewer and farther between until they stopped altogether. He carried the weight of that loss like a stone in his chest, but he didn't let it show on his face. Out here, a man's grief was his own business, and weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Scout, his saddle and tack, a bedroll, and the Navy Colt revolver that rode on his hip. He had his skills with horses and cattle, learned from his father and honed through years of hard work. Most importantly, he had his sense of right and wrong, a moral compass that pointed true north even when the world around him seemed to have lost its bearings. The town of Redemption Gap appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon, gradually resolving into a collection of buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the surrounding plains. As Elias drew closer, he could make out the details: false-fronted stores lining a main street that was more dust than road, houses scattered like dice thrown by a careless hand, corrals and stockyards on the outskirts where the smell of cattle hung thick in the air. It was a hard place. He could see that even from a distance, the kind of town that sprang up around cattle and money and the iron will of men who were strong enough or ruthless enough to carve out their piece of the frontier. The buildings looked weathered and temporary, as if they might blow away in the next strong wind, leaving nothing behind but the endless grass. Elias rode down the main street slowly, taking in the measure of the place. The Imperial Saloon dominated one corner, its bat-wing doors hanging slack in the heat. Across from it stood the general store, merchandise visible through windows hazed with dust. There was a hotel that had seen better days, a blacksmith's shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm, and various other establishments that catered to the needs of cowboys and ranchers. People moved along the boardwalks with the purposeful stride of those who had business to conduct and no time for idleness. Cowboys lounged in the shade, their spurs jingling as they shifted position. Women in calico dresses hurried past, their faces shaded by bonnets. A dog lay panting in the dust, too hot even to chase the flies that buzzed around its head. Elias dismounted in front of the general store, looping Scout's reins around the hitching post. His legs were stiff from the long ride, and he took a moment to stretch before stepping up onto the boardwalk. The interior of the store was dim and cluttered. Shelves stacked high with everything from ammunition to cloth bolts, from canned goods to farming implements. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous eyes, looked up from his ledger. Help you, stranger? Looking for work, Elias said simply. Heard there might be ranch jobs in these parts. The storekeeper's expression shifted, becoming cautious. Might be. Depends on what kind of work you're after and who you're willing to work for. I'm good with horses and cattle. Done my share of both. The man nodded slowly. Well, if you're serious about finding work, you'll want to talk to Mr. Croft. He owns the Circle C, biggest spread in the territory. Most of the other ranchers are small operations. Family affairs mostly. Croft's the only one hiring regular. Where might I find this Mr. Croft? Could be at his ranch, could be in town. He owns the Imperial across the way, and this store, come to that, owns half the town, one way or another. There was something in the storekeeper's voice, a mixture of respect and fear that Elias had heard before in places where one man held too much power. Elias thanked him and stepped back out into the glare of the afternoon sun. He was about to head for the saloon when a commotion down the street caught his attention. A small crowd had gathered, their voices raised in anger. Through the press of bodies, he caught a glimpse of what had drawn them. A young woman stood with her back against the wall of a small shop, facing down three men who loomed over her. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the fierce dignity in her bearing. Her skin was the color of honey, her dark hair worn in a simple braid, and her dress, though patched and faded, was clean and neat. There was something in her features, in the high cheekbones and the shape of her eyes, that spoke of mixed heritage. "Get on back to the reservation where you belong," one of the men was saying, his voice thick with contempt. "We don't need your kind peddling your heathen remedies here." "I have as much right to be here as you do," the woman replied, her voice steady despite the threat implicit in the men's postures. "My shop is legal. My remedies help people, and I pay my rent same as anyone." "Your rent won't mean much if your shop burns down some night," another man said, and there was ugly laughter from the crowd. Elias felt something stir in his chest, a familiar anger at the sight of the strong ganging up on the vulnerable. He had seen it too many times, had stood by too many times when he was younger and less sure of himself. Not today. He pushed through the crowd, his presence creating a ripple of silence as people noticed the stranger among them. The three men turned to face him, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to wary hostility. "Something we can help you with, stranger?" the largest of them asked, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Just wondering what kind of men it takes three of to threaten one woman," Elias said mildly, though his eyes were hard as flint. "This ain't your concern. You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work in Redemption Gap." "I understand plenty," Elias replied. "I understand you're bothering this lady, and I think it's time you moved along." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. The crowd had gone silent, waiting to see how this would play out. The woman watched with those dark, intelligent eyes, seeming to assess this unexpected defender. The moment might have exploded into violence, but a new voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "What's all this commotion?" The crowd parted, and a man strode through. He was perhaps 35, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of good looks that would have been at home in a San Francisco drawing room. His clothes were expensive, from the hand-tooled boots to the black hat that sat at a rakish angle on his head. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never met a situation he couldn't control. This, Elias knew instinctively, was Silas Croft. "Just having a conversation with the half-breed, Mr. Croft," one of the men said, his tone suddenly respectful. "She was giving us lip about—" Croft held up a hand, and the man fell silent immediately. Those cold blue eyes swept over the scene, taking in the woman, the three men, and finally settling on Elias with an expression of mild interest. "And you are?" "Elias Vance. Just rode in." "Looking for work, I suppose." "That's right." Croft smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Mr. Vance, you'll find we do things a certain way here in Redemption Gap. We take care of our own problems." He turned to the woman, and his smile became something different, something that made Elias's skin crawl. "Isn't that right, Lena?" We take care of each other here." The woman, Lena, met his gaze without flinching. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Croft." "Of course you can." He stepped closer to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Such a wild beauty," he said softly, but loud enough for others to hear, like a Mustang that hasn't been properly broken yet. The implication in his words was clear, and Elias saw Lena's hands clench into fists at her sides. But she said nothing, only continued to meet Croft's gaze with that unwavering dignity. Croft turned back to the crowd. "All right, show's over. You men get back to work." The three troublemakers melted away immediately, along with most of the onlookers. Soon, only Elias, Croft, and Lena remained on the street. "You still looking for work, Vance?" Croft asked, his tone conversational now. "I am. Can you handle horses?" "Well enough." "We'll see about that. Be at the Circle C at dawn tomorrow. My foreman, Hewitt, will put you through your paces. If you measure up, you've got a job." He paused, his eyes flicking between Elias and Lena. "A word of advice, though. A smart man learns quick which battles are worth fighting in a new town. Some things just aren't worth the trouble." With that, he touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness to Lena and strode away, his boot heels ringing on the boardwalk. Elias and Lena were left standing in the dusty street. She studied him for a long moment, seeming to weigh what she saw. "Thank you," she said finally. "Though you may have just made yourself an enemy. Wouldn't be the first time." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, I don't suppose it would be." She gestured to the shop behind her, a small building with a painted sign that read, "Herbal Remedies and Medicines," in neat letters. "I'm Lena Warren. This is my shop." "Elias Vance, like I said, you really know about medicines?" "My mother was Lakota. She taught me about the plants and their uses. Later, I learned from Dr. Morrison before he passed. I'm not a real doctor, but I help where I can. Must be difficult, running a business here." Her expression hardened slightly. "Everything worth doing is difficult. Mr. Vance," he touched his hat brim, "I'd best let you get back to it. Then, good day, Miss Warren." "Good day, Mr. Vance, and be careful tomorrow. Croft doesn't like men who challenge him, even in small ways." Elias nodded and walked back to where Scout waited patiently at the hitching post. As he led the horse toward the livery stable, he couldn't help but glance back. Lena still stood in front of her shop, a solitary figure of quiet defiance against the harsh backdrop of the town. There was something about her, something beyond her obvious beauty, that stirred feelings he had thought buried with his old life. The next morning came early, the sky still dark when Elias saddled Scout and rode out to the Circle C. The ranch was everything the storekeeper had implied, and more. The main house sat on a rise like a fortress, 2 stories of timber and stone that spoke of wealth and permanence. Barns and bunkhouses spread out below it, and beyond them, corrals filled with horses and cattle that stretched as far as the eye could see. He found Hewitt, the foreman, supervising the morning feed. The man was in his 50s, weathered as old leather, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You Vance?" "That's right. Croft says you can handle horses. We'll see about that." He gestured to a corral where a dozen unbroken mustangs milled nervously. "Pick one and show me what you can do." Elias spent the morning in the dust and heat, working with a particularly spirited mare who seemed determined to plant him in the dirt. But he had learned patience from his father, and he had a way with horses that went beyond mere skill. By noon, he was riding the mare around the corral while she responded to the lightest touch of the reins. Hewitt nodded approvingly. "You'll do. Bunk's in the second building there. Pays $30 a month and found. We work sunup to sundown. No exceptions. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Good. Get yourself settled and be back here in an hour. We've got cattle to move." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm of hard work and exhaustion. Elias threw himself into the job, grateful for labor that left him too tired to think much about the past. He kept to himself mostly, earning the respect of the other hands through his competence rather than his conversation. They were a rough bunch. Men who had drifted in from all corners of the frontier, bound together by their common need for wages and their fear of Croft's displeasure. He saw Croft occasionally, usually from a distance as the man surveyed his domain from horseback or strode through the ranch buildings like a general inspecting his troops. Up close, Croft was unfailingly polite to his men, but there was always that undercurrent of menace, the implicit understanding that his good humor could turn to wrath in an instant. And he saw Lena, though only from afar. Sometimes when he rode into town on errands, he would catch a glimpse of her entering or leaving her shop. Once, their eyes met across the street, and she offered him a small nod of recognition before hurrying on her way. He noticed how the townspeople treated her, the way they crossed the street to avoid her or spoke in whispers when she passed. It kindled that familiar anger in his chest. But he remembered Croft's warning and kept his distance. Then came the day that changed everything. They were driving cattle to the summer pasture, a week-long job that required all hands. Elias was riding flank when a rattlesnake spooked one of the steers. The animal bellowed and charged sideways, slamming into Scout and sending both horse and rider tumbling. Elias managed to roll clear, but not before the steer's horn caught his thigh, tearing through cloth and flesh in a burning line of pain. The other hands got him back to the ranch, where the company doctor, a man who reeked of whiskey even at midday, stitched the wound with shaking hands. Within 2 days, infection had set in. The wound was hot and swollen, red streaks beginning to crawl up his leg. Elias lay in his bunk, burning with fever, while the doctor mumbled about blood poisoning and shook his head. It was Hewitt who made the suggestion, standing over Elias's bunk with a frown of concern. "There's that woman in town, the one with the herb shop. I've heard she knows her business, whatever folks say about her." Through the haze of fever, Elias heard another hand scoff. "You want to trust his life to that half-breed witch? I want to trust his life to someone who ain't drunk before noon." Hewitt shot back. "Your choice, Vance, the doc here, or take your chances with the woman." It wasn't much of a choice. An hour later, Hewitt had loaded Elias into a wagon and driven him to town, pulling up in front of the small shop with its neat painted sign. Lena answered the door immediately, her eyes widening as she took in Elias's condition. "Bring him in," she said without hesitation. "Quickly!" The shop's interior was unlike anything Elias had expected. Clean and organized, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and shelves lined with glass jars containing various preparations. The air smelled of sage and mint and other scents he couldn't identify, a world away from the whiskey and sweat atmosphere of the bunkhouse. They laid him on a cot in the back room, and Lena went to work with a competence that spoke of long practice. She cut away the bloody bandages, her face grave as she examined the wound. "The infection is advanced," she said, speaking to Hewitt, "but not beyond help. I'll need to clean it thoroughly and apply a poultice. He'll need to stay here for at least a few days." Hewitt shifted uncomfortably. "Croft won't like that. Then Croft can come speak to me himself." Lena said crisply, "Right now, I have a patient to tend to." After Hewitt left, she worked in focused silence, cleaning the wound with something that burned like fire but left a strange, cooling sensation in its wake. Her hands were gentle but sure, and despite the pain, Elias found himself watching her face as she worked. Up close, he could see the fine lines of worry around her eyes, the determined set of her mouth. "This will hurt," she warned, preparing to stitch the wound properly. "Can't be worse than having it done by a drunk," he managed to say through gritted teeth. She glanced at him, surprised, and that ghost of a smile appeared again. "No, I suppose not." As she worked, the pain gradually began to recede, replaced by a strange, floating sensation. She had given him something for the pain, he realized, something that worked better than whiskey ever had. "Why did you step in that day?" she asked suddenly, not looking up from her work. "When those men were bothering me. Didn't seem right. 3 against 1. That's all." He was quiet for a moment, considering. The medicine had loosened his tongue, made it easier to speak truths he normally kept locked away. "My mother was the strongest woman I ever knew. raised 3 children, and kept a farm running while my father was away working other people's land for wages. Never complained, never gave up. Even when things got so bad we were eating boiled grass soup. She died trying to save what couldn't be saved, and I couldn't do anything to help her." He paused, feeling the old grief like a physical weight. "I suppose when I saw you standing there, facing them down with that same kind of strength, I couldn't just walk by." She had finished stitching and was applying a poultice that smelled of pine and something sharper. Her movements had slowed, and when she finally looked at him, there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite name. "Most men see me and see only what they want to see. The ones who hate me see a savage. The ones like Croft see something to be conquered. You're the first one in a long time who looked at me and saw strength." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not attraction, though that was there too, but something deeper. Recognition. Perhaps understanding. 2 people who had been shaped by loss and hardship, who had learned to stand alone because standing alone was safer than depending on anyone else. She broke the gaze first, busying herself with bandaging the wound. "You'll need to rest now. The fever should break by morning if the infection responds to treatment." Over the next 3 days, as Elias recovered in the small back room of her shop, they talked, not constantly, for she had work to do and he needed rest, but in the quiet moments between, she told him about growing up caught between 2 worlds, never fully accepted by either. Her mother had been cast out by her tribe for taking up with a white trader who abandoned them both when Lena was still young. They had survived on her mother's knowledge of healing plants and the kindness of a few, like Dr. Morrison, who saw past prejudice to the person beneath. He told her about the farm, about watching his parents pour their lives into land that gave nothing back, about the drought that lasted 3 years, the loans that seemed like salvation but turned into chains, the day the bank came to claim what generations of his family had built, about standing at his parents' graves and feeling like he had failed them in some fundamental way. They were careful conversations, dancing around the edges of deeper feelings, but in the way she smiled when he made her laugh, in the way he watched her move around the shop with quiet grace. Something was building between them that neither quite dared to name. On the 3rd day, as Elias was preparing to leave, Silas Croft arrived. He filled the doorway of the shop, his presence seeming to suck the air from the room. His eyes took in Elias, still pale but standing on his own feet, and Lena, who stood very straight beside her medicine cabinet. "Vance," he said pleasantly, "good to see you up and about. Hewitt says the wound was worse than we thought." "Miss Warren saved my life," Elias said simply. "Did she now?" Croft's gaze shifted to Lena, and that smile that never reached his eyes appeared. "How fortunate for all of us. Tell me, Lena, what do I owe you for your services?" "The same as I charge anyone else, $2. "So reasonable." He pulled out a gold piece worth $20 and set it on her counter. "Keep the change. Consider it appreciation for taking care of one of my best hands." She didn't touch the money. $2 will be sufficient. His smile widened. "Pride. I do admire that in a woman. Like a wild mustang. As I said before, all that spirit, just waiting for the right hand to gentle it." Elias felt his fists clench, but Lena's slight shake of her head stopped him from doing anything foolish. Croft turned back to him. "You fit to ride?" "I can manage." "Good. We need you back at the ranch, but don't push yourself too hard. I'd hate to lose a good worker because he didn't know when to take it easy." He paused at the door, looking back. "And Vance, I trust you'll remember what I said about knowing which battles are worth fighting. Some things in this town are already spoken for, even if they don't know it yet." The threat was silk-wrapped but unmistakable. After he left, Elias and Lena stood in silence for a moment. "You should go," she said quietly. "He doesn't own you." "No, but he thinks he does, and in a town like this, that's almost the same thing." She finally picked up the gold piece, staring at it with disgust before dropping it in her cash box. "Thank you for what you said, about your mother. And about me. He wanted to say more. Wanted to tell her that Croft was wrong, that she wasn't something to be owned or conquered. But the words stuck in his throat, too dangerous to speak aloud. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for saving my life. Take care of yourself, Elias Vance." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips stayed with him as he walked out into the harsh sunlight of Redemption Gap. He mounted Scout carefully, his legs still tender, and rode slowly back to the Circle C. That night, lying in his bunk while the other hands snored around him, he stared at the ceiling and thought about dark eyes and gentle hands, about strength disguised as quietness and dignity that shone through despite the world's attempts to dim it. He thought about Croft's threats and his own growing certainty that some battles, regardless of the cost, were always worth fighting. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the plains, and somewhere in the darkness between the ranch and town, his fate and Lena Warren's were already intertwining, pulled together by forces as inexorable as the turning of the seasons. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, of keeping his head down and staying out of trouble. But Elias knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that trouble was coming whether he sought it or not, and when it came, he would not stand aside. Not this time. The wound on Elias's leg healed slowly, giving him legitimate reason to return to Lena's shop twice a week to have the dressing changed. At first, he told himself it was purely practical. Infection in this country could kill a man as surely as a bullet. But he knew he was lying to himself the moment he found himself looking forward to those visits, with an anticipation that had nothing to do with medical care. She would greet him with that same quiet professionalism. But he began to notice small changes, a softness in her eyes when she saw him at the door, the way her fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary when checking the healing skin, how she had started keeping a pot of coffee warm on her small stove, though he had never asked for it. "You're healing well," she said during his fourth visit, her fingers gentle as she removed the old bandage. "Another week and you won't need these anymore." "That's good news," he said, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of losing this excuse to see her. She must have heard something in his voice because she glanced up at him, a question in her dark eyes. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. "I found something yesterday," he said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Up in the hills when I was checking the north pasture." He pulled out a small leather pouch and handed it to her. She opened it carefully, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Bear root," she breathed, examining the dried roots. "I haven't been able to find any for months. Where did you—" "There's a grove of aspens about 5 miles north of the ranch, near a limestone outcrop. I remembered you mentioning you were running low." She looked at him with something like wonder. "You remembered that?" "I pay attention when you talk." The words hung between them, heavier with meaning than he had intended. She busied herself storing the precious roots in one of her glass jars, but he could see the faint color in her cheeks. After that, the gifts became a regular thing, never anything that would draw attention or gossip. He was too careful for that. A book of poetry he had found in the bunkhouse, left behind by some departed cowboy. A rabbit he had snared, knowing her stew pot was often empty as customers grew fewer. Once, a small piece of quartz shot through with veins of gold that caught the light like captured sunshine. "You don't need to bring me things," she told him one day, though she cradled the quartz in her palm like something precious. "I know I don't need to," he replied simply. She began to reciprocate in her own way, a small tin of salve for the rope burns that were an occupational hazard of ranch work, a packet of herbs to brew into tea that would ease the ache in muscles pushed too hard. Once, shyly, a pair of socks she had knitted from wool she had traded for, because she had noticed his were more whole than fabric. It was during one of these visits that she mentioned the cottonwood grove. "There's a place I go sometimes," she said carefully, not quite meeting his eyes. "When the town feels too small and the walls too close, it's about a mile east, where Willow Creek makes that bend. There's a grove of old cottonwoods there." He understood what she was offering, A chance to meet away from the watching eyes of the town, away from the constraints of doctor and patient, shopkeeper and customer. The risk was enormous for both of them, but the promise of time together without the weight of others' judgment was too powerful to resist. "I know the place," he said. "It's peaceful there." "Yes," she agreed, finally looking at him. "Especially in the evening, when the sun is going down." 3 days later, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Elias told Hewitt he was going to check on a horse he'd seen limping near the creek. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had seen such a horse. He just didn't mention that he had already checked on it that morning and found it perfectly sound. He approached the grove carefully, Scout picking his way through the tall grass that grew near the water. The cottonwoods rose like ancient sentinels, their leaves whispering secrets in the evening breeze. The air was cooler here, sweetened by the scent of water and green-growing things. She was already there, sitting on a fallen log near the creek's edge, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen it before. When she heard Scout's approach, she turned, and the smile that crossed her face made his heart stumble in his chest. "You came," she said simply. "Did you doubt I would?" "I hoped," she admitted, making room for him on the log. "But hope and certainty are different things." They sat in companionable silence at first, watching the water flow over smooth stones, listening to the evening birds begin their sunset chorus. It was Lena who spoke first, as if the peaceful setting had unlocked something inside her. "My mother used to bring me to places like this when I was young," she said. "Before she got sick, she would teach me about the plants, show me which ones could heal and which could harm. She said the knowledge was in our blood, passed down through generations of grandmothers." "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was, but wisdom doesn't protect you from the world's cruelty." Lena picked up a small stone and tossed it into the creek. "When she took up with my father, the trader, her family cast her out, said she was dead to them, and when he left us, the white townspeople wanted nothing to do with a woman who had lain with an Indian. She was caught between worlds, belonging to neither. That must have been hard, for both of you." "It was, but she never let me see her cry. She just worked harder, learned everything she could about healing from anyone who would teach her. Dr. Morrison took pity on us, let her assist him sometimes. That's how I learned the white man's medicine to go along with my mother's teachings." She paused, her voice growing softer. "She died when I was 16, lung fever, all her knowledge, all her remedies, and I couldn't save her." Alias wanted to reach for her hand but held back, unsure if the gesture would be welcome. "It wasn't your fault." "I know that. Here." She touched her head. "But here?" She placed her hand over her heart. "That's different." The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The light caught in her hair, turning it to burnished copper. Without thinking, Elias reached out and tucked a loose strand behind her ear. She went very still at his touch, but she didn't pull away. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What ghosts do you carry?" So he told her, about the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations, about his father, a man who believed that hard work and honest dealing would always be rewarded, who broke his body trying to make the land yield what it couldn't give, about his mother, singing hymns while she cooked supper from increasingly meager supplies, never complaining even when there wasn't enough to go around. "The drought started 5 years ago," he said, staring at the water as if he could see the past reflected there. "First year, we thought it was just bad luck. Second year, we started borrowing against the farm. By the third year, we were eating boiled wheat and whatever game I could shoot. Pa kept saying the rains would come, that we just had to hold on a little longer. But they didn't come. No, they didn't." He picked up his own stone, sent it skipping across the water. "Pa worked himself into the grave trying to save what couldn't be saved. Ma followed him 6 months later. Doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think she just gave up. My brother Tom had already left for California, chasing gold that probably doesn't exist. My sister Mary went east to work in a mill. And you?" "I stayed until the bank took everything. stood at their graves and apologized for failing them. Then I saddled Scout and started riding. Been riding ever since. You didn't fail them, Lena said firmly. You can't fight the weather. You can't make rain fall or crops grow through will alone. Maybe not, but I should have seen what was happening sooner. Should have convinced Pa to give up while we still had something to sell, something to start over with. This time it was Lena who reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on his knee. We all carry things that weren't our fault. Elias, the weight of them doesn't make them true. He turned his hand palm up, lacing his fingers with hers. Her hand was small in his, calloused from work but gentle in its strength. They sat like that as the sun touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of fire. I should go, she said eventually, though she made no move to withdraw her hand. It'll be full dark soon. I know, but neither of them moved. The air between them had grown charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were soft and vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. Elias, she whispered, and then he was leaning toward her, drawn by a force as inexorable as gravity. Their first kiss was tentative, a question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. Her lips were soft against his, tasting faintly of the mint tea she favored. When they parted, her eyes were closed, her face tilted up to his like a flower seeking sun. Lena, he breathed, and kissed her again, deeper this time, his hand coming up to cradle her face. She made a small sound in her throat and pressed closer, her fingers tightening on his. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing unsteadily. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deepening purples and blues. The first stars were beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. We shouldn't, she said, but her hand was still in his. I know. If Croft finds out, he won't. Elias squeezed her hand gently. We'll be careful. She studied his face in the fading light. Is it worth it? The risk? You are, he said simply, and watched her eyes fill with tears she refused to shed. After that evening, the grove became their sanctuary. They met when they could, sometimes twice a week, sometimes only once, depending on the watchful eyes of the town and the demands of work. Each meeting was a stolen piece of paradise, a world they built together word by word, touch by touch. They talked about everything and nothing. She taught him to identify the different plants that grew near the water, their medicinal properties and folklore. He taught her to read the weather and the behavior of birds and the color of the sunset. They shared dreams they had never spoken aloud, his of a small ranch of his own, where a man could build something lasting, hers of a place where her skills were valued and her heritage wasn't a mark of shame. Oregon, she said one evening, lying on a blanket he had brought, staring up at the stars. I've heard there are towns there where people are too busy building new lives to care about who your parents were. Montana might be better, he suggested, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. More open land, fewer people to ask questions, somewhere with trees, she added, and water that runs all year, and no one named Silas Croft for 1,000 miles. She laughed softly, but then grew serious. Do you really think we could do it? Just leave everything and start over? People do it all the time. That's what the frontier is, people starting over. Together? He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I can't imagine it any other way. But even in their private paradise, the outside world intruded. Croft's shadow grew longer and darker with each passing week. Elias began to notice things. How Croft would appear in town on the days Elias had errands there. How his cold blue eyes would track Elias's movements. Once, returning from the grove, Elias found Croft waiting by the ranch gate. Evening ride, Vance, Croft asked pleasantly, though his eyes were sharp as broken glass. Thought I saw some strays near the creek. Elias replied evenly. Find any? No, sir. Must have been shadows. Shadows? Croft smiled that cold smile. Funny thing about shadows. Sometimes they show us things we don't want to see. Man needs to be careful he doesn't get lost chasing shadows. The threat was clear, and Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. But worse was to come. Lena's few remaining customers began to fall away. Mrs. Patterson, who had relied on Lena's remedies for her arthritis for years, suddenly declared she was feeling much better. Tom Brennan, whose son Lena had nursed through scarlet fever, crossed the street to avoid her. When she asked why, he muttered something about not wanting trouble and hurried away. Then Sheriff Brody started his campaign. First, it was a fine for an improperly displayed business sign, then for selling medicines without a territorial license, though no such license had ever been required before. Each fine ate into her meager savings, money she needed for rent and food. "Let me help," Elias urged during one of their meetings. She had told him about the fines, trying to make light of it, but he could see the strain in her eyes. "No." Her refusal was immediate and firm. "I won't take your money. It's not charity. It's you trying to save me, and I won't be saved." She softened her words with a touch to his cheek. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time. Elias, I won't start depending on anyone now, not even you." "Especially me?" "Especially you," she agreed. "Because depending on you would make what we have into something else, something less than what it is." He understood, even as it frustrated him. Her independence was part of what had drawn him to her in the first place. But understanding didn't ease the helpless rage he felt watching Croft slowly tighten the noose around her. The breaking point came when Croft bought her building. Elias heard about it from Hewitt, who mentioned it casually over supper. "Boss bought the Warren building today. Got it from the bank for a song, they say. Guess that means he owns pretty much the whole street now." Elias's blood ran cold. He managed to finish his meal and wait until after dark before slipping away to the Grove. Lena was already there, and one look at her face told him she knew. "He came to see me this afternoon," she said without preamble. "Made a point of introducing himself as my new landlord, said he'd been thinking the rent was too low. Said a prime commercial property like mine should bring in at least 3 times what I've been paying. That's robbery. That's the point." She laughed bitterly. "He gave me a month to come up with a new rate or get out. A month. Elias, where am I supposed to get that kind of money in a month?" "We leave," Elias said urgently. "Tonight. Pack what you can carry and we'll—" "With what?" she interrupted. "Your $30 a month? My savings that have been eaten up by fines? We wouldn't make it 50 miles before we starved or someone caught up with us. Then I'll get the money another way." "How? Robbing banks? Stealing from Croft?" She shook her head. "You're not that kind of man. Elias, it's one of the reasons I—" She stopped herself, but he heard what she didn't say. "One of the reasons you what?" She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "One of the reasons I love you." She finished quietly. It was the first time either of them had said the words aloud. Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "I love you too," he whispered into her hair. "Which is why I can't stand by and watch him destroy you." "You have to," she said against his chest. "Promise me you won't do anything foolish. We'll find another way. We'll save every penny, sell what we can. We'll find a way to leave that doesn't require you becoming someone you're not." He wanted to argue, but the desperation in her voice stopped him. "All right," he said finally. "We do it your way. But if he pushes any harder—" "He won't," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "He's made his point. He'll wait now. Let me struggle and fail. That's how men like him operate. They like to watch their prey exhaust itself before they move in for the kill." But Croft wasn't content to wait. 2 days later, old Jed Perkins's cabin burned to the ground. Jed was a prospector who lived alone in the hills, coming to town once a month for supplies. He was one of the few people who still treated Lena with kindness, often bringing her unusual herbs he found in his wanderings. He was harmless, a little touched in the head from too many years alone, but gentle as a child. The fire happened at night. By the time anyone saw the smoke, the cabin was fully engulfed. They found Jed outside, beaten bloody, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was alive, but barely. Sheriff Brody investigated, of course. His conclusion was that Jed had knocked over a lantern in a drunken stupor and injured himself trying to escape the flames. Never mind that everyone knew Jed didn't drink. Never mind the boot prints around the cabin that didn't match Jed's worn moccasins. Never mind that several people had seen 3 of Croft's men riding out toward the hills that evening. Lena tended Jed as best she could, but the damage was too great. His body might heal, but his spirit was broken. He sat in the corner of her shop, staring at nothing, flinching at every sound. "It's my fault," she said that night at the Grove. She wasn't crying, but her face was terrible in its stillness. "He's punishing anyone who shows me kindness. First the customers, now Jed. Who's next?" Elias didn't answer because they both knew who would be next if Croft discovered their relationship. Instead, he simply held her as the darkness gathered around them, feeling her fury like a living thing between them. "I hate him," she said finally, the words coming out hard and sharp. "I've never hated anyone the way I hate him. Not the boys who threw stones at me when I was young. Not the women who whisper behind their hands when I pass. Not even my father for abandoning us. But Croft?" She pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were like flint. "I could kill him myself and sleep soundly after." "Don't say that." "Why not? It's true." She stood abruptly, pacing to the creek's edge. "I'm tired of being afraid. Elias, tired of bowing my head and keeping quiet and hoping they'll leave me alone if I'm good enough, quiet enough, white enough. They never leave us alone. They just find new ways to remind us we don't belong." He went to her, standing behind her as she stared at the dark water. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together." She leaned back against him, and he wrapped his arms around her. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fooling ourselves, thinking we can run far enough to escape what we are. You're a failed farmer turned cowboy with nothing to your name. I'm a half-breed herb woman that no decent town would welcome. What kind of life can we really build? An honest one?" he said firmly. "A free one. That's more than most people get." She turned in his arms, looking up at him in the moonlight. "Do you ever regret it, getting tangled up with me? Your life would be simpler if you just kept riding that day." "Simpler isn't better," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "I'd rather have complicated with you than simple alone." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, and he tasted salt on her lips. They clung to each other in the darkness. 2 people building a fortress of love against a world determined to tear them apart. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his chest. "1 month," she said quietly. "That's what we have to figure this out. 1 month before he comes to collect his impossible rent. We'll figure it out," he promised, though he had no idea how. As they left the grove separately, their usual precaution, Elias looked back at the dark trees and the glimmer of water. This place had become sacred to them, a church of cottonwood and starlight where they worshipped at the altar of each other. But like everything beautiful in this hard country, it was fragile, vulnerable to the cruel whims of powerful men. Riding back to the ranch through the darkness, Elias made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whatever he had to do or become, he would not let Croft destroy the woman he loved. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Some battles, once joined, could only end in victory or death. But for now, he would keep his promise to Lena. He would be patient. He would be careful. And he would be ready when the time for patience ended. The map was old and worn, its creases so deep they had begun to tear. But to Elias and Lena, it represented hope itself. They spread it carefully on the blanket in their grove, weighing down the corners with smooth river stones as the evening breeze tried to steal it away. "The Oregon Trail splits here." Lena traced the route with her finger, her voice low and urgent. "If we follow it to Fort Bridger, we could break north into Montana territory. There's a town called Helena growing there. They say it's booming with the gold strikes. Too busy for anyone to care about a mixed couple." Elias studied the distances, calculating in his head. "That's near 800 miles. With a good wagon and team, traveling careful, that's 2 months on the trail. maybe more if the weather turns. I've been saving what I can, she said, producing a small leather pouch from her dress pocket. It's not much, $23 and some change. But if we sell everything we don't need, I've got $47, Elias added. Been putting aside every cent I could. That's $70 between us. It'll have to be enough. They had gone over it dozens of times in the past 2 weeks, refining their plan with the desperate precision of people whose lives depended on every detail. They would need a wagon, nothing fancy, just something sturdy enough to make the journey, 2 horses, or better yet, mules that could handle the mountain passes. Supplies for 2 months, flour, salt pork, coffee, beans, ammunition for hunting along the way. There's a settlement called Cedar Falls about 60 miles south, Elias said. They have a weekly market. I could ride down, buy what we need without raising suspicion. Tell Hewitt I'm visiting a sick friend. Lena nodded, but her eyes were troubled. It feels too easy, like Croft is letting us plan this. Maybe he doesn't know. We've been careful. He knows. Her certainty was absolute. A man like him doesn't get where he is without knowing everything that happens in his domain. He's watching, waiting, as if to prove her right. The very next day brought a change so unexpected it set the whole town talking. Croft announced at the saloon that he had been too harsh with the Warren woman. Perhaps, he said with that practiced smile, he had let his business instincts override his Christian charity. Effective immediately, he was forgiving her first month's increased rent, giving her more time to adjust to the new rates. The townspeople ate it up, praising his generosity, some even suggesting that Lena should be more grateful for such kindness. But when Elias saw her that evening at the Grove, her face was pale with fear rather than relief. He's playing with us, she said, like a cat that's caught a mouse but isn't hungry yet. Then we don't give him time to get hungry. Elias replied, I'll ride to Cedar Falls tomorrow. But when he went to the blacksmith the next morning to inquire about purchasing a wagon, old Sam Garrett shook his head regretfully. Sorry. Vance, sold my last one yesterday. Won't have another built for at least a month. Elias could see 2 wagons in the yard behind the shop, one newly painted and the other awaiting repair. What about those? Those? Sam wouldn't meet his eyes. Those are already spoken for. Special orders. It was the same at the livery stable, where Jonas Hartwell suddenly remembered that all his horses were promised to other buyers. Though the stable was full of fine animals, the general store was mysteriously out of the travel supplies Elias tried to purchase. No trail flour, no salt pork, no camping gear. Might try ordering from Denver, the clerk suggested nervously. Take about 6 weeks to arrive, though 6 weeks they didn't have. Elias left the store with a growing certainty that Croft's net was tightening around them. The man's reach extended to every business in town, his influence as pervasive as dust in the wind. The social isolation grew worse by the day. Where once the townspeople had merely avoided Lena, now they actively shunned her. Women gathered their children close when she passed, as if her mixed blood was a contagion that might spread. Men spat in the dust after she walked by. Someone painted "Breed" on her shop door in the night, the ugly word a scar on the wood that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. At the ranch, Elias found himself similarly isolated. Conversations ceased when he approached. Men he had worked beside for months now treated him like a stranger, or worse, like a threat. He took his meals alone, worked the farthest ranges alone, slept in a bunk surrounded by empty space as the other cowboys moved their gear away from his. Heard you been spending time in town regular-like, one cowboy named Beck said one evening, his tone casual but his eyes hard. Man ought to be careful about the company he keeps. Bad associations can ruin a good reputation. I'll keep that in mind, Elias replied evenly, though his fists clenched at his sides. See that you do. Boss don't like his men bringing trouble to the ranch. And that Herb woman? She's nothing but trouble. The warning was clear. Elias was being watched, his movements tracked and reported. He began taking elaborate precautions when meeting Lena, riding out in different directions before circling back to the Grove. sometimes waiting hours to ensure he wasn't followed. Their meetings took on a desperate quality. Where once they had dreamed and planned with hope, now they clung to each other with the fierce intensity of people who knew their time was running out. Every kiss felt stolen, every embrace a small act of rebellion against the forces trying to tear them apart. "I found a man in Laramie who sells horses," Elias told her one night, 3 weeks after Croft's supposed change of heart. "No connection to Croft, far enough away that word won't travel quick. I'll tell Hewitt I need a week to visit my sister back east. I'll ride hard to Laramie, buy 2 good horses, and be back before anyone knows different." "A week," Lena repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "That's a long time to be gone." "It's the only way. We need those horses. Lena, without them, we're trapped here." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dark water of the creek. "I'm scared," she admitted finally. "Not of leaving, not of the journey. I'm scared of what he'll do when you're gone. He won't touch you. Too many people watching now, especially after his big show of forgiveness. He needs to maintain his image." "His image?" She laughed bitterly. "Yes, the generous benefactor who took pity on the poor half-breed woman. How noble of him." Elias pulled her close, feeling the tremor that ran through her body. "1 week," he promised. "Then we're gone. We'll leave everything behind and start fresh. Just you and me and whatever we can carry." "Just you and me," she repeated, and lifted her face for his kiss. They parted that night with more reluctance than usual, both feeling the weight of impending separation. As Elias rode back to the ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake, that leaving her alone even for a week was inviting disaster. But what choice did they have? Without horses, they were as surely imprisoned as if Croft had built iron bars around the town. He left 3 days later on a gray dawn, telling Hewitt his fabricated story about a sick sister. The foreman grunted his acceptance. He had no reason to doubt Elias, who had been nothing but reliable since his hiring. "Week's a long time to be gone," Hewitt observed. "Sure, this sister of yours is worth it?" "Family's always worth it," Elias replied, hating the lie but knowing it was necessary. "Suppose so. Well, don't let your horse break down on you. Long ride to Kansas." Elias touched his hat brim and rode out, Scout moving with eager energy beneath him. He didn't look back, didn't see the rider who detached himself from the shadows an hour later to follow at a discreet distance. Didn't know that his every move had been anticipated and planned for. The journey to Laramie was hard and fast. Elias pushed Scout as much as he dared, camping cold to avoid the smoke of a fire, sleeping little and riding long. The landscape blurred past, endless grassland giving way to rocky hills, streams crossed at dangerous fords, nights spent listening to coyotes howl at a moon that seemed to watch him with Croft's cold eyes. He reached Laramie on the 4th day, tired but triumphant. The horse trader, a leather-faced man named Elijah Morse, was as honest as advertised. Elias bought 2 solid mares, both young and strong, both trained for saddle and harness. They cost him dear, nearly all his savings, but they were worth it. With these horses and Scout, they could make good time to Montana. "Fine animals," Morse commented as Elias tested their paces. "Taking them far?" "Far enough," Elias replied carefully. "Well, they'll serve you well. Fed them good grain all winter, kept their feet trimmed proper. Whatever journey you got in mind, they'll see you through it." Elias bedded down in the livery that night, unwilling to spend money on a hotel room. Tomorrow he would begin the ride back, leading the 2 mares on a string. 5 days back if he was careful, 4 if he pushed hard. Lena would be watching for him, probably standing at her shop window every evening, counting the days until his return. He dreamed of her that night, dreamed of the life they would build in Montana. A small cabin by a clear stream, maybe a few cattle, certainly a garden where she could grow her herbs. Children, eventually, with her eyes and his stubbornness, growing up free of the prejudice that had shadowed their parents' lives. It was a good dream, and he held on to it even as he woke to the gray dawn and began the long ride home. It was late afternoon on the 5th day when he saw the riders. He had been making good time, the mares trailing docilely behind Scout, the familiar landscape of Wyoming rolling past. The sight of horsemen on the horizon wasn't unusual. This was cattle country, after all. But something about the way they sat their horses, the deliberate manner of their approach, sent warning signals through his tired mind. As they drew closer, he recognized Sheriff Brody's distinctive gray hat, saw the glint of badges on the other men's chests. A posse. His heart began to pound, but he kept Scout to a steady walk. Running would only confirm whatever suspicion had brought them out here. "Elias Vance," Brody called out when they were within hailing distance. "Need you to stop right there and keep your hands where we can see them." "Sheriff?" Elias nodded, reining in Scout and raising his hand slightly. "Something wrong?" "That's what we're here to find out." Brody's hand rested on his pistol butt, and the other men, 5 of them, all hard-faced and armed, spread out to surround him. "Where you been, Vance?" "Laramie, buying horses, as you can see." "That's so. Funny thing. We heard you were visiting a sick sister in Kansas." Elias's heart sank, but he kept his face neutral. "Plans changed. Heard about these horses for sale. Figured it was too good an opportunity to pass up." "Uh-huh." Brody's smile was thin and mean. "Well, while you were gone on your horse-buying trip, something interesting happened at the Circle C. Someone killed 3 of Mr. Croft's prize bulls, butchered them professional-like, took the best cuts and left the rest to rot. I don't know anything about that. I've been gone 5 days. Plenty of witnesses in Laramie who can vouch for me." "Maybe so. But funny thing about these killings, we found this near the scene." Brody produced something from his saddlebag, and Elias's blood ran cold. It was his knife, the distinctive bone-handled blade his father had given him, the one he always kept in his bunk at the ranch. "That's mine," he said slowly. "But I didn't have it with me. It was in my gear at the ranch." Convenient story. Man about to run off with stolen horses might say anything. "These horses aren't stolen. I bought them fair and square. I have a bill of sale." "Could be forged. We'll have to check that out. In the meantime, you're under arrest for rustling and destruction of property. Maybe murder too, if we decide those bulls were killed cruel enough to warrant it." "This is insane. Why would I kill Croft's bulls? What would I gain?" "Money, for one thing. Beef to sell to fund your running off with that breed woman." Brody's grin widened at the flash of anger in Elias's eyes. "Oh yeah, we know all about that. Croft's been real patient with you, Vance, but his patience has limits. Now, you can come quiet, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Elias looked at the armed men surrounding him, calculated his chances, and found them non-existent, even if he could somehow fight his way free. What then? They'd hunt him down, and his resistance would only confirm his guilt in the minds of the townspeople. His only chance was to go quietly, hope that the truth would come out, that someone would see through Croft's obvious frame-up. "I'll come quiet," he said, dismounting slowly. "But I want it on record that I'm innocent of these charges." "Noted," Brody said cheerfully. "Now hand over that gun. Nice and easy." They took his Navy Colt, tied his hands, and led him back to Redemption Gap like a common criminal. People came out to stare as they rode down Main Street, their faces a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. He had challenged the natural order of things, had dared to want what wasn't his to want, and now he was paying the price. The jail was a squat building of stone and iron, built to hold men until they could be tried or hanged. The cell they put him in was small and dark, with only a narrow window set high in the wall to let in light and air. The bunk was a wooden shelf with a thin, bug-infested mattress. A bucket in the corner served as a privy. "Make yourself comfortable," Brody said as he locked the heavy iron door. "You'll be here a while. Trial's set for 3 days hence. Judge Carter's coming special from Cheyenne to preside." 3 days? What about my right to a lawyer? You got money for a lawyer? Elias thought of his savings, spent on the horses that were now impounded as evidence. "No. Then you'll have to make do with what the court provides. I'm sure justice will be served." Brody's tone made it clear what kind of justice he expected. After the sheriff left, Elias stood at the small window, gripping the bars and straining to see out. From this angle, he could just make out a slice of Main Street, could see the corner of Lena's shop. The lamp in her window was lit, a small beacon in the gathering dusk. She would have heard by now. The whole town would be buzzing with the news of his arrest. She would know it was a trap, would understand that Croft had played them perfectly, waiting until they were separated to spring his snare. He thought of her alone in her shop, surrounded by enemies, with no one to turn to for help. Thought of Croft, free now to pursue whatever dark plans he had for her. The fury that rose in him was like nothing he had ever felt, a rage so pure it seemed to burn through his veins like liquid fire. He had been a fool to leave her, a fool to think he could outwit a man like Croft. Now he was caged like an animal, facing a trial that would be nothing but a formality before they put a rope around his neck. And Lena, brave, fierce, beautiful Lena, was left to face the wolf alone. As night fell over Redemption Gap, Elias sank onto the hard bunk and put his head in his hands. Through the small window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over their stolen moments in the cottonwood grove. He wondered if she was looking at them too, if she was thinking of him. He wondered if he would ever hold her again. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made him look up. For a wild moment, he hoped it might be her, come to see him despite the danger. But it was only the deputy bringing his supper, a plate of beans and a heel of stale bread. "Eat up," the deputy said, sliding the plate under the door. "Might be your last good meal." Elias ignored the food, returning to the window. Lena's light still burned in the distance, a tiny star of hope in the darkness. He pressed his face against the cold bars and made a silent vow. Somehow, some way, he would get out of this cell. He would not let Croft win. He would not leave Lena to face her fate alone. But even as he made the promise, he knew the odds were impossibly stacked against them. Croft held all the cards, had anticipated every move, had trapped them as neatly as a spider traps a fly. The light in Lena's window flickered and went out. The darkness that replaced it seemed to swallow all hope, leaving only the cold reality of iron bars and the certainty of the gallows. Somewhere in the night, a coyote howled, its voice carrying all the loneliness and desperation that filled his heart. Elias closed his eyes and tried to hold on to the memory of her touch, her kiss, the sound of her laughter in their secret grove. It might be all he had left. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and barely concealed bloodlust. Word of Elias Vance's arrest had spread through Redemption Gap like wildfire, and now it seemed every soul in town had crowded into the small building to witness what everyone knew would be a foregone conclusion. Judge Cornelius Carter sat behind the bench like a vulture perched on a fence post, his black robes doing nothing to hide his predatory nature. He was a circuit judge from Cheyenne, but everyone knew he owed his position to Silas Croft's influence and money. His arrival in town for this special session had been greeted with knowing looks and whispered conversations. Elias sat at the defendant's table, his hands shackled, 3 days' growth of beard on his face. The court-appointed defender, a nervous young man named Timothy Garrett, who had only recently passed the bar, shuffled papers with trembling hands. He had visited Elias once in jail, listened to his story, and then advised him to plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the court. "There is no mercy in this court," Elias had told him flatly. "Croft owns it all." Now, as the proceedings began, Elias scanned the crowd for Lena. She sat in the back row, her face a mask of controlled anguish, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance, he tried to convey everything he couldn't say aloud, his love, his regret, his fierce desire for her to stay strong no matter what happened. "The territory of Wyoming versus Elias Vance," Judge Carter intoned, his voice carrying the weight of false authority. "The defendant stands accused of cattle rustling, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit theft. How does the defendant plead?" Young Garrett stood, clearing his throat nervously. Not guilty, Your Honor. Very well. Prosecutor, present your case. The territorial prosecutor, a man named Josiah Blackwood, who wore his corruption as comfortably as his expensive suit, rose with theatrical gravity. Your Honor, we will show that the defendant, motivated by greed and a desire to fund his planned flight from justice, did willfully and maliciously slaughter 3 prize bulls belonging to Mr. Silas Croft, intending to sell the butchered meat for profit. The parade of witnesses began. First came Jake Morrison, a Circle C ranch hand who claimed to have seen Elias near the pasture where the bulls were kept on the night in question. It was definitely Vance, Morrison swore, though his eyes never quite met Elias's. Saw him clear as day in the moonlight, acting suspicious-like. On cross-examination, Garrett tried his best. Mr. Morrison, you say you saw clearly in the moonlight. Can you tell the court what phase the moon was in that night? Morrison faltered. Well, it was bright enough to see, according to the almanac, Garrett said, producing the document. There was no moon that night. It was the new moon. And must have been starlight then, Morrison amended quickly. Or maybe I got the date wrong, but it was Vance. I'd swear to it. The next witness was Samuel Hensley, another ranch hand, who testified that he had heard Elias talking about needing money, about how the cattle were worth more dead than alive. He said that exact phrase? Garrett asked on cross-examination. Worth more dead than alive? Something like that, Hensley mumbled. Can't recall the exact words. And where was this conversation? In the bunkhouse. Were there other men present who might have heard this? I don't recall, but the most damning evidence was the knife. Sheriff Brody himself took the stand to describe finding it at the scene, still bearing traces of blood. And you're certain this is the defendant's knife? Blackwood asked. No doubt about it. That bone handle is distinctive. Everyone at the ranch knew it was Vance's. His PA gave it to him. He used to say... Garrett rose for cross-examination. Sheriff, when you found this knife, where exactly was it? Near the carcasses, half buried in the dirt, like someone dropped it in a hurry. I see. And in your experience, do professional rustlers often leave behind such obvious evidence? Brody's face darkened. Criminals make mistakes when they're in a hurry. Indeed. Tell me, Sheriff, was anything else found at the scene? Any tracks leading away? Any evidence of where the supposed stolen meat was taken? The ground was all churned up from the cattle. Couldn't make out individual tracks. How convenient. And the meat that was supposedly stolen, was any of it recovered? Found for sale anywhere? Not yet. So we have 3 dead bulls, a conveniently dropped knife, and no actual stolen property recovered. Is that correct? The evidence is clear, Brody said stubbornly. That knife puts Vance at the scene. When it came time for the defense, Garrett did his best with what little he had. He called the horse trader from Laramie, Elijah Morse, who had traveled to testify. Mr. Vance was in my stable the night those bulls were killed, Morse stated firmly. Bought 2 horses from me, paid fair price. He was there from sundown to sunup. No way he could have been in 2 places at once. But Blackwood was ready for this. Mr. Morse, how do you know what night the bulls were killed? Well, the date I was told, but you have no first-hand knowledge of when the crime occurred, do you? For all you know, it could have happened before the defendant reached Laramie or after he left. I suppose, but no further questions. Elias himself took the stand, against Garrett's advice. He spoke clearly and firmly, maintaining his innocence, explaining about the horses, about his missing knife that anyone could have taken from the bunkhouse. Why would I kill Croft's cattle? He asked, looking directly at the jury. What possible gain would there be? I had a job, wages coming in. I had no quarrel with Mr. Croft or his property. No quarrel? Blackwood smiled coldly. Isn't it true you've been conducting an improper relationship with the half-breed woman who runs the herb shop? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Elias felt heat rise in his face, but kept his voice steady. Miss Warren and I are acquainted. Yes, more than acquainted. I think, isn't it true you've been meeting secretly? That you were planning to run away together? That you needed money for this escape? That's not. Answer the question. Mr. Vance, were you or were you not planning to leave town with Lena Warren? Elias glanced at Lena, saw the pain in her eyes. We had discussed the possibility of starting fresh elsewhere. Yes, but that had nothing to do with. So you admit you needed money for this plan. You admit you had a motive for theft. I had saved my wages. I didn't need to steal. Your wages? Blackwood scoffed. $30 a month. Hardly enough to start a new life. Unless, of course, you supplemented it with stolen beef. The questioning went on. Each answer twisted. Each explanation turned into an admission of guilt. By the time Elias stepped down, he knew it was hopeless. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. The jury deliberated for exactly 15 minutes. When they filed back in, not one man would meet Elias's eyes. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Carter asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman replied, "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in noise, some cheers, some gasps. One anguished cry from the back that Elias knew was Lena. Judge Carter banged his gavel for order. "Elias Vance," he intoned with obvious satisfaction, "you have been found guilty of cattle rustling and destruction of property. By the laws of this territory, I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until dead. The execution will take place in 3 days' time at sunrise. May God have mercy on your soul." The gavel fell with finality. Elias was hauled to his feet by the deputies, the shackles heavy on his wrists. As they let him out, he managed one last look at Lena. She sat frozen, her face white as bone, her eyes wide with horror. He tried to smile, tried to give her some sign of hope or comfort, but there was none to give. Back in his cell, the reality of his situation crashed over him like a physical weight. 3 days, 3 sunrises left in his life. He thought of all the things he would never do, all the words he would never say. Mostly, he thought of Lena, alone and unprotected, facing whatever dark plans Croft had for her. That night, as he lay on the narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, he heard footsteps in the corridor. Sheriff Brody appeared, keys jangling. "Got a visitor for you. Vance." Against my better judgment, but the lady was most insistent. The door swung open, and Lena stepped inside. The sheriff locked the door behind her. 10 minutes, he said gruffly. That's all. Then they were alone, separated by iron bars but closer than they had been in days. She reached through the bars, and he grasped her hands, feeling the tremor that ran through her. "Elias," she whispered, and then she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't waste our time on tears. How can you be so calm? They're going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know what they're going to do, but listen to me. Lena, you have to leave town, tonight, if possible. Take whatever you can carry and go. Don't look back." "I can't leave you. You have to. Croft won't be satisfied with my death. He'll come for you next, and there won't be anyone to stop him." She pulled her hands free, pacing the small space outside his cell like a caged animal. "There has to be another way. Maybe if I talk to the governor, if I petition—" "Lena," his voice was firm. "We both know there's no justice to be found here. Croft owns it all." She stopped pacing, turned to face him. There was something in her expression, a desperate resolve that made his blood run cold. What if there was a way to save you?" "What are you talking about?" She came back to the bars, gripping them so tightly her knuckles went white. "Croft came to see me tonight." Elias felt his heart stop. What did he want? He made me an offer." The words came out in a rush. "He said he could stop the execution, get the governor to commute your sentence to prison time, or arrange an escape. He has the power. We both know he does. What's the price?" But even as he asked, he knew. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. "Me," she whispered. "He wants me to marry him, to be his wife in name, his property in truth. If I agree, You live. If I refuse. No. The word exploded from him. Absolutely not. I forbid it. A spark of her old fire flashed in her eyes. You forbid it? You're hardly in a position to forbid anything. Lena, please. I would rather die 1,000 times than see you bound to that monster. Promise me you won't do this. You're asking me to let you die. I'm asking you to let me die free, knowing the woman I love is free as well. That's all I want. Lena, that's all that matters. She was crying again, but silently, the tears falling unheeded. How can you ask this of me? How can you expect me to stand by and watch them kill you when I have the power to prevent it? Because living as Croft's slave would be worse than death. For both of us. Do you think I could bear the knowledge of what my life cost you? Do you think that wouldn't be its own kind of hell? Time's up, Brody called from the corridor. Promise me, Elias said urgently. Promise me you won't sacrifice yourself for me. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes swimming with tears and something else, a determination that terrified him. Goodbye, Elias, she said softly. I love you. Lena, promise me. But she was already turning away, and Brody was unlocking the door to let her out. She didn't look back, didn't say another word. The door clanged shut behind her, and Elias was left alone with the terrible certainty that she had not promised him anything. The next 2 days passed in a blur of desperate prayer and mounting dread. Elias barely ate, barely slept, his mind consumed with thoughts of what Lena might do. He had no more visitors. Croft had no doubt seen to that. His only company was the young deputy, Thomas Harlan, who brought his meals and emptied his slop bucket. Harlan was different from the others. Barely 20 years old, he had a conscience that hadn't yet been crushed by the weight of frontier corruption. He lingered sometimes, clearly troubled by what was happening. It ain't right, he muttered on the second evening, setting down Elias's supper tray. Everyone knows Croft set you up, but nobody will say anything. Power has a way of silencing truth. Elias replied, Still ain't right. A man ought to die for his own crimes, not someone else's convenience. The night before the execution, Elias couldn't bring himself to lie down. He stood at the small window, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking of nights spent with Lena under these same stars. Tomorrow they would build the gallows in the town square. Tomorrow the town would gather to watch him die. And tomorrow, he feared, Lena would make a sacrifice that would destroy her as surely as the rope would destroy him. Dawn came gray and cheerless, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Elias heard the hammering as they completed the gallows. Each blow of the hammer another countdown to his death. He dressed carefully in his best shirt, the one Lena had mended for him weeks ago, her tiny stitches still visible where a tear had been. Harlan came with his breakfast, but his manner was strange, nervous and excited at once. Eat up, he said, louder than necessary. Then, leaning closer, he whispered, Be ready. Before Elias could ask what he meant, Harlan was gone. Be ready for what? The walk to the gallows? Death? Or something else? The hour of execution arrived with the tolling of the church bell. Elias heard footsteps in the corridor, multiple sets. The execution party come to collect him. But something was wrong. The footsteps were hurried, almost frantic. The door burst open. It was Harlan, his young face flushed with determination and fear. In his hand were the keys to Elias's shackles. What are you? No time, Harlan hissed, fumbling with the locks. Croft played his last card. Told Miss Warren he'd already arranged a commutation, that her sacrifice was just for his amusement. The bastard wanted to break her spirit for nothing. The shackles fell away. Elias rubbed his wrists, his mind reeling. Where is she? At Croft's house. She went there this morning to accept his offer, not knowing it was all a game, but I heard him laughing about it with the sheriff, boasting about how he'd won everything. I couldn't stand it anymore. Nobody deserves what he's done to you both. You're risking your life. My life's worth nothing if I can't live with myself. There's a horse outside, saddled and ready. Take it and go. Save her if you can. Then get out of this cursed town. Elias gripped the young man's shoulder. "I won't forget this. Go, now, before they realize." Shouts erupted from outside. The alarm had been raised. Elias ran, following Harlan through the jail's back entrance. Sure enough, a horse waited. Harlan's own mount, a sturdy gray gelding. Elias swung into the saddle, his body remembering the motion despite days of confinement. Which way to Crofts? North Road, the big house on the hill. But Elias, be careful. He's got men everywhere. But Elias was already spurring the horse forward, riding hard toward the destiny that awaited on the hill. The town blurred past, faces turning in shock as they recognized the condemned man racing through their streets. Someone fired a shot, but it went wide. Then he was past the town limits, pounding up the road toward Crofts' mansion. The house loomed before him, a monument to ill-gotten wealth and power. He dismounted at a run, leaving the horse loose, and burst through the front door. A servant shrieked and fled. He followed the sound of voices, Crofts' cultured tones carrying down the hallway. "Really thought your pathetic sacrifice would matter? My dear Lena, you have so much to learn about power. The governor's commutation was sent 2 days ago. I just wanted to see if you would actually degrade yourself for nothing. And you did. You actually came here, ready to sell yourself for a man who was never going to hang. How delightfully—" Elias kicked open the door. The scene before him burned itself into his memory. Croft standing triumphant, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Lena, her face a mask of horror and dawning realization, trembling as the full scope of Croft's cruelty became clear. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Croft's eyes widened in shock. "How? You talk too much." "Croft," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "Always did." Croft dropped the glass, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip, but Elias had heard every word of his confession, had seen Lena's shattered expression, and rage gave him speed. He crossed the room in 3 strides, catching Croft's wrist before he could draw. They grappled, crashing into furniture. Croft fighting with the desperate strength of a man who had never faced real consequences. But Elias fought with the fury of love betrayed, of justice too long denied. They rolled across the floor, each struggling for control of the weapon. "Elias!" Lena's voice cut through the chaos. She had grabbed something, a heavy bookend, and stood ready to help. The gun went off, muffled between their bodies. For a moment, both men froze. Then Croft made a sound, a surprised gasp, and blood began to spread across his white shirt. He looked down at it with an expression of genuine bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite believe that Silas Croft, could actually be dying. "Impossible," he whispered. And then his legs gave out. Elias caught him as he fell, lowering him to the floor almost gently. Croft's eyes were already glazing, but they fixed on Lena one last time. "Should have been mine," he gasped. "I was never anyone's," Lena replied quietly. "That's what you never understood." Croft's breath rattled once more, and then he was still. The door burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, gun drawn, taking in the scene. His face went through several expressions: shock, calculation, and finally a kind of weary resignation. "Well," he said slowly, "looks like Mr. Croft died defending himself against an escaped prisoner. Tragic loss for the town." He looked at Elias and Lena. "You've got about 5 minutes before I raise the alarm. I'd suggest you use them wisely." He turned and walked away, leaving them staring after him in astonishment. "Why?" Lena called after him. Brody paused at the doorway. "Even a bought man has limits. Croft crossed mine when he started playing God with people's lives for fun. 5 minutes. Don't waste them." Then he was gone, and they were alone with the cooling corpse of their tormentor. Elias pulled Lena into his arms, holding her as she shook with reaction. "It's over," he whispered. "He's gone. He can't hurt us anymore." "We have to go," she said against his chest. "They'll still come after us. We're murderers now, in the eyes of the law." "Then we'd better get started on that new life we talked about." They ran together, hand in hand. back to where the gray gelding waited. Behind them, they could hear Brody's voice raised in alarm, playing his part. They had minutes, maybe less, before pursuit began. But for now, they were free of Croft, free of Redemption Gap, free to chase that dream of Montana skies and a life built on love rather than fear. The future was uncertain, the road dangerous, but they would face it together. As they rode hard into the wilderness, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the dust of the past from their faces and preparing the ground for whatever seeds they would plant in the days to come. The moment hung suspended, Croft's confession still ringing in the air like a death knell. Then everything erupted into chaos. Elias moved first, launching himself across the room with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The knife Harlan had pressed into his hand, a simple blade, nothing fancy, felt insignificant against what he knew Croft carried. But rage gave him speed. Croft's eyes widened in shock, his hand dropping to the Colt at his hip. But he had been drinking, celebrating his victory, and the whiskey made him a heartbeat too slow. Elias crashed into him before the gun cleared leather, both men slamming into an ornate side table that splintered under their weight. They rolled across the floor, Croft fighting with the vicious skill of a man who had clawed his way to power through violence. His fist connected with Elias's jaw, sending stars across his vision. But Elias had been strengthened by months of hard labor, driven by a fury that transcended pain. He drove his knee into Croft's stomach, heard the satisfying whoosh of expelled air. The gun skittered across the polished floor. Both men lunged for it, but Croft was closer. His fingers closed around the grip just as the door burst open and two of his men rushed in, Murphy and Steele, both gun hands known for their quick triggers and absent consciences. "Kill him!" Croft roared, struggling to aim as Elias grappled with him for the weapon. Murphy raised his pistol, drawing a bead on Elias's back. Time seemed to slow, and Elias knew with terrible certainty that he was about to die. Then Lena moved. She had been frozen by shock, her mind struggling to process Croft's sadistic revelation. But the sight of Murphy's gun aimed at Elias shattered her paralysis. The iron poker from the fireplace was in her hands before conscious thought formed. She swung it with all the strength her desperate love could summon. The poker connected with Murphy's arm just as he fired. The shot went wide, plowing into the ceiling and raining plaster down on them. Murphy howled, his gun falling from nerveless fingers as the bone in his forearm snapped. Steele turned his weapon toward Lena, and Elias felt his blood turn to ice. He released his hold on Croft's gun hand, using the momentum to roll away as Croft fired. The bullet meant for his head tore through his left shoulder instead, spinning him around and painting the wall with blood. The pain was enormous, but Elias had no time for it. Steele was still aiming at Lena. With his good arm, Elias grabbed a heavy bookend from a fallen shelf and hurled it. His aim was true. The bronze eagle caught Steele in the temple, dropping him like a felled tree. Croft scrambled to his feet, gun still in hand, face twisted with rage. "You dare!" he snarled, leveling the weapon at Elias. "You worthless saddle tramp! You dare lay hands on me!" Elias struggled to rise, his left arm useless, blood soaking his shirt. There was nowhere to run, no cover to take. He met Croft's eyes steadily, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of seeing fear. "I dare," he said simply. Croft's finger tightened on the trigger, and Lena brought the poker down on his skull. The sound was wet and final. Croft's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled, the gun falling from slack fingers. Blood began to pool beneath his head, dark and spreading on the expensive carpet. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then Murphy groaned, cradling his broken arm, trying to crawl toward his fallen weapon. Lena stood over him, poker raised. "Don't," she said quietly, and something in her voice, a terrible resolve, made him freeze. Footsteps pounded in the hallway. More men coming. Elias scooped up Croft's gun with his good hand, then grabbed Steele's as well, passing one to Lena. "We have to go," he gasped, swaying on his feet. She moved to his side, supporting him. "Can you ride?" "I'll ride to hell if it gets us out of here." They stumbled toward the door, but it burst open before they reached it. Sheriff Brody stood there, gun drawn, taking in the carnage, Croft motionless in his blood, Murphy whimpering on the floor, Steele unconscious or worse. "Drop the weapons," Brody commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes kept returning to Croft's body, something shifting in his expression. "He's dead," Lena said. "Your master is dead." "I said drop them." Elias raised Croft's gun, knowing he was probably too slow, knowing they had come so far only to die here. But his hand was steady despite the blood loss, and his aim didn't waver from Brody's chest. "You heard the lady," Elias said. "Your master is dead. Question is, do you want to join him?" Brody's jaw worked, conflict clear on his face. Then, slowly, he holstered his weapon. "5 minutes," he said quietly. "You've got 5 minutes before I sound the alarm. Whatever you're going to do it fast." He turned and walked away, leaving them staring in amazement. They didn't waste time questioning their fortune, supporting each other. They fled through the house, past terrified servants who pressed themselves against walls to avoid them. The stable was their salvation. Croft's horses were the finest in the territory, bred for speed and stamina, grain-fed and strong. Elias could barely pull himself into the saddle, his shoulders screaming protest, but Lena was there to help, her hands gentle but urgent. "2 horses," she said, leading out a second mount. "We'll need to switch when these tire." They rode hard into the gathering dusk, the sound of pursuit not yet risen behind them. But it would come, they both knew. Soon enough, the town would rouse itself. The death of Silas Croft would not go unanswered. By full dark, Elias was slumping in his saddle, only his iron will keeping him mounted. Lena rode close, one hand on his good arm, steadying him. "We need to stop," she said. "You're losing too much blood." "Not yet, not close enough to town." They pushed on for another hour before finding a shallow cave in a hillside, barely more than an indentation in the rock. Lena helped him down, and he bit back a scream as the movement jarred his shoulder. By the light of a tiny fire, all they dared risk, she examined the wound. The bullet had passed through, which was good, but the damage was extensive. She used strips torn from her petticoat to bind it, packing it first with moss and spider webs, an old remedy her mother had taught her. "This will help the blood clot," she murmured, working with steady hands despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "But you need proper medicine. Yarrow, willow bark for the fever that's coming." "Lena," he caught her hand, stilling her movements. "We killed them. Croft, maybe Steele too. We're murderers now." She met his eyes fiercely. "We're survivors. They would have killed us. Elias, you know that." "The law won't see it that way. Then we'll go where the law can't reach." She resumed her work, binding the wound tight. "Sleep now. I'll keep watch." But sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Croft's face, felt the warm spray of blood. When dawn came, gray and cold, they were both hollow-eyed with exhaustion. They rode through that day and the next, always heading north and west, into the mountains where pursuit would be difficult. They avoided towns, skirted ranches, became shadows moving through a landscape that grew increasingly wild and unforgiving. On the 3rd day, Elias's fever struck with vengeance. He burned and shivered by turns, muttering incoherently, barely able to stay in the saddle. Lena tied him to his horse with rope, leading both animals while searching desperately for the plants she needed. She found yarrow growing near a stream, its white flowers like small mercies in the wilderness. Willow trees provided bark for tea. She made camp in a hidden grove, forcing the bitter medicines down his throat while he thrashed in delirium. "Don't leave me," he mumbled, caught in some fevered dream. "Please, Lena, don't go." "Never," she whispered, bathing his burning face with cool water. "I'm here. I'll always be here." For 2 days she fought for his life, barely sleeping, living on creek water and the few strips of jerked beef they had grabbed from Croft's kitchen. She snared a rabbit with a loop of rope, made thin broth that she spooned between his cracked lips. When the fever finally broke, when his eyes opened clear and focused on her face, she wept with relief. "You stayed," he said wonderingly. "Where else would I go?" She helped him sit up, noting with satisfaction that the wound, while still angry, showed no signs of infection. "You're all I have now. All I want." They were deeper in the mountains now, the terrain growing ever more rugged. Autumn was coming on fast at this elevation, the aspens turning gold, the nights sharp with frost. They needed shelter, needed to rest and recover before pushing on to Montana. It was Lena who spotted the cabin, half hidden in a grove of pines. It was small and long abandoned, the roof partially caved in, the door hanging askew. But the walls were solid, built from good logs by someone who knew their craft. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, but only dust and pack rats had claimed the space. Inside, they found the remains of a life interrupted. A rusted stove, a broken chair, shelves that had once held supplies. Marks on the wall might have been a calendar, tracking days that had stopped mattering to whoever had lived here. "Trappers, maybe," Elias said, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Or prospectors. These mountains are full of men who came seeking fortune and found only solitude." They set to work, making it livable. Despite his wound, Elias insisted on helping, using his good arm to clear debris while Lena chinked gaps between logs with mud and moss. They patched the roof with pine boughs, cleaned years of grime from the small window, made the place as weathertight as they could. Their first night in the cabin, with a fire crackling in the repaired stove and the door barred against the world, they finally allowed themselves to feel safe. They sat close together on a bed made of pine boughs and their saddle blankets, sharing the last of their meager food. "We can't stay here forever," Lena said quietly. "I know, but for now, just for a while. We can rest, heal, plan." He touched her face with his good hand, marveling that she was here, that they were alive. "I'm sorry I brought this on you. If I hadn't come to Redemption Gap, if I hadn't—" She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "If you hadn't come, I would have lived and died in that town, ground down by their hatred until there was nothing left of me. You gave me hope, Elias. You gave me love. You gave me the courage to fight back. We're fugitives now. We'll always be looking over our shoulders. Then we'll look together." She leaned into him carefully, mindful of his shoulder. "Tell me what troubles you. All of it." So he did, in the safety of their rough shelter, with the wilderness holding them in its vast silence. He spoke of the guilt that gnawed at him, not for Croft, that death felt like justice long overdue, but for what they had become, for the blood on their hands and the price on their heads. "My father was a peaceful man," he said. "Never raised a hand in anger his whole life. He'd be ashamed to see what I've done." "Your father never had a gun pointed at the woman he loved," Lena countered. "Never had to choose between conscience and survival. You're not a killer, Elias. You're a man who was pushed past all endurance." She shared her own burdens then, speaking of the moment in Croft's study when she had believed her sacrifice was real, when she had been ready to sell her soul for Elias's life. "I would have done it," she admitted. "Would have married him, borne his touch, lived as his property. The thought makes me sick now, but in that moment, faced with losing you, I would have paid any price." "That's not weakness, that's love. Is it, or is it just another kind of cage?" She stared into the fire, her profile etched in gold and shadow. "All my life I've fought to be free, to belong to no one but myself. Then you came along, and suddenly I was ready to throw it all away. But you didn't. When it came down to it, you fought, you survived. We both did." She turned to him then, and in her eyes he saw the same mix of love and fear and determination that he felt in his own heart. "I don't regret it," she said firmly. "Not Croft, not running, not any of it. I regret that we had to become outlaws to be together, but I don't regret choosing you." They kissed then, carefully because of his wound, but with all the desperate passion of two people who had walked through fire and emerged scarred but whole. When they finally drew apart, The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. In the days that followed, they fell into a routine born of necessity. Lena foraged for edible plants and set snares for small game. Elias, his shoulders slowly healing, gathered firewood and reinforced their shelter against the coming winter. They were careful with their ammunition, knowing that every shot risked discovery. The horses grew sleek on mountain grass, their noble heads often lifted to test the wind for danger. Once, they heard riders in the distance and spent a terrified day hidden in the cabin, weapons ready, hardly daring to breathe. But the sound faded without coming closer, and they never knew if it was bounty hunters or simply travelers passing through. At night, they talked, with no one but each other and the vast silence of the mountains. Words came easier. They spoke of childhood memories, of dreams deferred and hopes that seemed impossible now. They planned too, studying Elias's worn map by firelight, plotting routes to Montana that avoided settlements and main trails. "There's a place called Whitefish," Elias said, tracing the route with his finger. "Growing town, lots of newcomers. We could blend in, start fresh. I could find work. You could set up a shop." "Under what names? Elias Vance and Lena Warren are wanted for murder." They were quiet, contemplating this brutal truth. Then Lena spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "My mother once told me that names have power, but only the power we give them. We could choose new ones, become new people. What would you choose?" She considered. "Something simple. Mary, perhaps. Mary Johnson. And I could be John Johnson." He smiled at the plainness of it. No one would look twice at John and Mary Johnson. "A new life," she murmured. "Do you think it's possible?" "I think we've already done the impossible. We loved in a place that forbade it. We survived when they tried to destroy us. We're here, together, free. After that, anything seems possible." The first snow came early, drifting down like a blessing that would hide their tracks and lock them away from the world. They watched it fall from the doorway of their cabin, standing close together, sharing warmth. "Winter's coming fast," Lena observed. "We should move on before the passes close, or we could stay," Elias suggested quietly. "Wait out the winter here. Let the hunt die down. Let the world forget about us. Come spring, we'll be different people. Your hair will be longer, my beard fuller. Time and distance will blur memories." She leaned against him, considering. The cabin was rough but solid. They had learned to hunt, to forage, to survive. The isolation that might drive others mad felt like safety to them. "A winter together," she said. "Just us in the mountains." "Is that enough?" She turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held all the answer he needed. "It's everything," she said simply. As the snow continued to fall, transforming the harsh landscape into something softer and more forgiving, they retreated into their cabin. The fire crackled in the stove, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the world they had fled seemed very far away. Held at bay by winter's protective embrace, they were outlaws. Yes, fugitives with blood on their hands and prices on their heads, but they were also survivors, bound by a love that had endured betrayal, violence, and exile. In this rough cabin, in this wilderness that asked no questions and demanded only strength, they had found their sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Winter would test them in new ways. Spring might force them to run again, to seek that elusive place where John and Mary Johnson could build a life free from the shadows of Elias Vance and Lena Warren. But tonight, with the snow sealing them away from the world and the fire warming their small space, they were simply two people who had chosen each other over everything else. And for now, that was enough. The mountains stood sentinel around them, ancient and indifferent, keeping their secrets. And in the morning, when the sun rose on a world made new by snow, they would face it together. Winter came to the mountains like a conquering army, laying siege to their small valley with walls of snow and battalions of freezing wind. But Elias and Lena met it as they had met everything else, together, with determination forged from necessity and strengthened by love. The first heavy snowfall trapped them completely, sealing the passes and turning their refuge into a white-wrapped world of profound isolation. They had prepared as best they could, gathering firewood until their hands bled, smoking what meat Elias could hunt before the game fled to lower elevations, and storing roots and dried berries in the cool darkness beneath the cabin floor. Their days took on a rhythm as regular as heartbeat. Dawn meant tending the fire that could never be allowed to die, melting snow for water, checking the horses in their rough shelter. Elias's shoulder had healed enough for him to swing an axe, though Lena could see the pain that still flickered across his face with certain movements. She had become expert at reading him, just as he had learned to interpret the subtle shifts in her mood. The work was endless. They chinked and re-chinked gaps between logs as the wood contracted in the cold. They repaired snowshoes found hanging in the cabin, ancient things that fell apart after first use and had to be rewoven with strips of hide. They rationed their food with mathematical precision, knowing that one miscalculation could mean starvation before spring. But it was the nights that tested them most. When darkness fell at 4 in the afternoon and stretched endlessly until the late winter dawn, when the wind howled like all the demons of their past come calling, when the cold pressed in despite the fire, those were the hours when the ghosts came visiting. Elias would wake gasping from dreams where the rope was already around his neck, where he could see Lena in the crowd below, screaming his name as the floor dropped away. Or worse, dreams where he was back in Croft's study. But this time his hands were too slow, the gun too heavy, and Croft's bullet found its mark while Lena watched in horror. "It's all right," she would whisper, holding him close despite his sweat-soaked trembling. "You're here. We're safe. It's all right." But she had her own demons. Some nights he would wake to find her sitting by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow with tears frozen on her cheeks. When he asked what troubled her, she would shake her head, unable to put words to the weight that pressed on her chest. The memory of that moment when she had been willing to sell her soul, the echo of Croft's laughter when he revealed his cruel game. "I almost lost myself," she said once, on a particularly bad night when the wind shrieked like accusation. "I was ready to become something I despised. And for what? For a lie. He made me choose hell when heaven was never even at stake." "But you didn't lose yourself," Elias reminded her, pulling her back to bed, back to warmth. "You survived him. We both did." They learned to navigate each other's darkness with the same careful attention they gave to navigating the treacherous, snow-covered paths around their cabin. When Elias grew too quiet, lost in guilt over the violence that had freed them, Lena would draw him out with small tasks, teaching her to better aim Croft's pistol, showing her how to read weather signs in the clouds. When she retreated into herself, he would coax her to tell stories of her mother, of the plant lore that had been passed down through generations. Their love evolved in that winter crucible, transformed from the desperate passion of their early days into something deeper and more enduring. It was in the way they moved around each other in the small space, never colliding, always aware. It was in how they shared the last piece of meat without discussion, each trying to give it to the other. It was in the quiet evenings when they sat close by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, needing no words because their silence said everything. February brought the worst blizzard, 3 days of white fury that buried their door and threatened to collapse the roof under the weight of snow. They took turns through the night, one sleeping while the other knocked snow from the rafters with a long pole. When it finally ended, they emerged into a world transformed, sculptured into alien beauty by wind and ice. It was while digging out the horse's shelter that Elias saw the tracks, fresh ones, leading down from the high pass and skirting their valley before disappearing into the trees. Human tracks, accompanied by the narrower marks of what might have been a dog or wolf. They spent that day in tense vigilance, weapons close at hand, taking turns watching from the window, but no one appeared, and the next snowfall erased the tracks as if they had never been. Still, it served as a reminder that their isolation was not absolute, that the world they had fled still existed beyond their white-wrapped valley. March arrived with the promise of spring still distant but perceptible, like a whisper heard from the next room. The sun grew stronger, turning the icicles that fringed their roof into glittering daggers that dripped during the warmest part of the day. Lena began to talk of the garden she would plant when the ground thawed, and Elias expanded the horse shelter in preparation for foaling season, though their mares had not been bred. It was on one of these lengthening days that the trapper appeared. They saw him coming from a distance, a dark figure against the snow, moving with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the mountains. He had a dog with him, so those had been the tracks, and a string of marten pelts that spoke of a successful season. Elias and Lena exchanged glances, a whole conversation in a look. They could hide, pretend the cabin was still abandoned, or they could face whatever this visit might bring. In the end, it was curiosity as much as hospitality that made them open the door. The trapper was old, his face a map of wind-carved lines and sun-darkened leather. His eyes, bright blue in that weathered face, took in everything, the obviously lived-in cabin, the two of them standing close together, the wariness in their postures. "Name's Josiah," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Josiah Frost. Don't mean to intrude, but I saw your smoke. Been a long winter, and a man gets hungry for the sound of human voices." They invited him in, caution warring with the ingrained frontier courtesy that demanded hospitality for travelers. Lena heated the last of their coffee, a luxury they had been hoarding, while Elias and the old man sat by the fire, sizing each other up. "Been trapping these mountains for 20 years, Josiah said, accepting the coffee with hands that shook slightly from age or cold. "Never knew anyone was using old McKenna's place." "McKenna?" Lena asked. "Built this cabin, 15 years back. Came up here after his wife died. Said he wanted nothing more to do with the world below. Found him frozen one spring, sitting in that very chair, peaceful as you please, like he just decided he was done and let the cold take him. They absorbed this history of their shelter, another ghost to add to their collection." Josiah sipped his coffee, those sharp eyes moving between them, taking in details. Elias's city-bought boots, now worn but still obviously not local make. Lena's mixed features, the way they positioned themselves to face the door, never quite relaxing. "Come far?" he asked casually. "Far enough." Elias replied, "Heading farther. When the pass is clear." Josiah nodded slowly. "Smart to wait. These mountains don't forgive impatience." He paused, then added, "Came up through Redemption Gap last month. Town's in quite a state." Both Elias and Lena stiffened, but tried to hide it. Josiah continued as if he hadn't noticed. "Seems they lost their big man, Silas Croft, him and the sheriff both, killed by some desperado last fall. Whole town's turned upside down. Federal marshals came through, investigating Croft's dealings. Turns out he was crooked as a snake's path, land fraud, extortion, even murder, they're saying." "Is that so?" Lena managed, her voice carefully neutral. "Indeed. Course, they're still hunting for the killer. Or killers. Stories vary. Some say it was one man, others say two. There's paper out on them." He reached into his coat, and both Elias and Lena tensed, but he only pulled out his tobacco pouch. "Saw one of the wanted posters. Drawing wasn't much good, though could have been anybody." He filled his pipe with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving their faces. "Funny thing about those posters, they're offering $1,000 for a man named Elias Vance, another $1,000 for a woman named Lena Warren." He struck a match, puffed the pipe to life. Big money for folks nobody can properly describe. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Elias's hand had drifted to where his gun would be, though he wasn't wearing it. Lena stood frozen by the stove, coffee pot still in her hand. Then Josiah chuckled, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "Course, I never did learn to read too good, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. Man could walk right past someone from those posters and never know it." He stood, joints popping in protest. "I thank you for the coffee and the company. Been a pleasure talking with folks who know how to mind their own business." At the door, He paused. The high country has a short memory, you know. Stay up here long enough, and the world below forgets you exist. Those that don't belong down there anyway have a way of finding peace in these mountains. He shouldered his pack, whistled for his dog. Oh, nearly forgot. He pulled out a small cloth bag. Salt, worth its weight in gold up here. And this, a new flint, for your kindness to an old man. After he left, Elias and Lena stood in silence, processing what had just happened. A stranger had come, had clearly recognized them or at least suspected, and had chosen to leave them in peace. More than that, had warned them, helped them. He knew, Lena said finally. He knew. Elias agreed. And he didn't care, or he cared more about justice than law. They were quiet again, contemplating this unexpected grace. Then Lena laughed, a sound that startled them both. It had been so long since either had laughed freely. $1,000? She said. Is that all I'm worth? I'm insulted on your behalf, Elias said, finding himself smiling. You're worth at least 2,000. Flatterer. That night, for the first time in months, they made love with something approaching joy rather than desperate comfort. The knowledge that someone had seen them, recognized them, and chosen mercy over money had lifted a weight they hadn't fully realized they were carrying. They were still fugitives, still exiled, but they were not entirely cast out from human kindness. Spring came slowly to the high country, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated in stages, revealing brown earth that soon sprouted with desperate green life. The creek that had been silent under ice began to sing again, swollen with snowmelt. Lena planted her garden with seeds she had saved from their meager winter vegetables and wild seeds gathered the previous fall. She worked the dark soil with a devotion that was almost religious, coaxing life from earth that had known only cold and darkness for so long. Elias watched her work, seeing in her careful tending of fragile shoots a metaphor for how they had tended each other through the winter. He busied himself with expanding their domain. He built a proper porch on the cabin, a place to sit and watch the evening light paint the mountains. He improved the horse shelter, thinking ahead to next winter, already assuming they would stay. The thought of leaving, of venturing back into a world that wanted them dead or imprisoned, grew less appealing with each passing day. They still carried their trauma. Elias still woke sometimes with phantom rope burns on his neck. Lena still flinched when shadows fell a certain way, reminding her of Croft looming over her. But the episodes grew fewer, the recovery faster. They were healing, as surely as Elias's shoulder had healed, leaving scars but restoring function. One evening in late May, as Lena tended her young plants and Elias split wood for the pile that would see them through another winter, they became aware of how thoroughly they had adapted to this life. Their clothes were patched with deer hide, their hands calloused in new places, their rhythms aligned with the sun and seasons rather than any human schedule. "Are we still planning to go to Montana?" Lena asked that night as they sat on the new porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Elias considered the question. They had enough money hidden away, taken from Croft's house in their flight, to start fresh somewhere. The passes were clear, the weather favorable for travel. But, "Do you want to?" he asked instead of answering. She was quiet for a long time. "I thought I did. All winter, I dreamed of towns where nobody knew us, of shop windows and church bells and children playing in streets. But now," she gestured at the valley, "their kingdom of solitude. This is home, isn't it? We made it home." "We did," he agreed. "Though it's not much of a life for you. No neighbors, no friends, no place to use your healing skills except on me when I do something foolish." "I have you," she said simply. "I have our garden, our horses, our home. I have mountains that don't judge and sky that doesn't whisper behind my back. Is that not enough?" "It's everything." He echoed her words from their first night in the cabin. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead. The same stars that had witnessed their desperate flight now blessed their quiet peace. Josiah might come back, Elias pointed out. Others might find us too. Then we'll deal with them as they come. With hospitality if they bring peace. With force if they bring trouble. She squeezed his hand. We're not the same people who fled Redemption Gap. That town broke Elias Vance and Lena Warren. But it also freed us to become whoever we choose to be. And who do we choose to be? She turned to him. And in the starlight her face was serene with hard-won wisdom. Ourselves. Simply and truly ourselves. Summer arrived in full glory, painting the meadows with wildflowers and filling the air with the buzz of insects and the songs of birds. Lena's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables to supplement their diet of game and foraged plants. Elias hunted with increasing skill, learning the patterns of deer and elk, the seasons of plenty and scarcity. They were not entirely self-sufficient. They would need supplies before next winter, things that couldn't be made or grown or hunted. But for now, in the fullness of summer, they could pretend the outside world didn't exist. It was August when Lena made her announcement. She had been quiet for several days, thoughtful in a way that made Elias nervous. When she finally spoke, standing in her garden with dirt on her hands and sun in her hair, her words stopped his heart. I'm with child, she said simply. The axe fell from his nerveless fingers. He crossed to her in 3 strides, searching her face. You're certain? As certain as a woman can be. 2 months gone, maybe a little more. A child, here, in their exile, in their refuge. His hands moved without his conscious will to rest on her still flat belly, and the wonder that filled him was like nothing he had ever known. Are you happy? She asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice at his silence. Happy? He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed and protested about her garden rose. I don't have words. Lena, a child? Our child. Born to fugitives. She reminded him when he set her down. Born to a life of hiding. Born to parents who love each other, he countered. Born to freedom, even if it's a hard freedom. Born to mountains and sky and all the room in the world to grow. They stood together in the garden, holding each other, adjusting to this new reality. A baby would change everything, would make their isolation both more difficult and more precious. But as Elias felt Lena relax against him, felt her acceptance and even joy in what was coming, he knew they would meet this challenge as they had met all the others. Together, always together. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Their horses grazed peacefully in the meadow. The garden grew green and promising around them. And in Lena's womb, new life grew as well. A testament to hope and renewal, and the stubborn persistence of love in the face of all odds. They had not conquered the world. They had not vanquished the prejudice and hatred that had driven them to this place. They had not cleared their names or reclaimed their place in society. But they had survived. They had endured. They had built something precious from the ashes of their old lives, and in the vast, indifferent wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. 2 souls who had been broken by the world had found a way to heal each other. It was not the life they had planned, but it was the life they had chosen, and they would live it on their own terms until the end of their days. The stars came out, ancient witnesses to yet another human story of loss and redemption. And in the cabin where a lonely man had once chosen death, 2 people chose life, chose love, chose to continue despite everything. It was, perhaps, the greatest victory of all. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West, and please share where you are tuning in from so we can connect with listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts in English in the comments below.